Never before in the gruesome history of the Annex, the official term used then for Ohio's death row, was witnessed such a horrible and sickening sight as that which attended the execution of Michael G. Schiller, serial number 34925, the Youngstown wife murderer. Just after midnight on June 17th, 1904. Electrician Martin had tested the chair several times that evening and pronounced it in perfect order. Schiller grew extremely nervous when he heard the officers testing the chair and spent the evening pacing restlessly back and forth in the death cage. He flatly refused all spiritual consolation and would tolerate the presence of neither preacher nor priest. He ate sparingly of his supper and refused to take stimulants of any kind, whiskey. He had maintained all along that something would intervene to save him from the chair. He had hopes that the governor would, at the last moment, commute his death sentence to one of life imprisonment. He watched the old annex clock with an anxious heart as it slowly registered the flow of the river of time into the ocean of eternity. At 11:30 p.m., the attending guards filed into the death cage accompanied by the prison barber. John O'Brien, the genial, good-natured, time-honored guard, who has witnessed more legal executions perhaps than any man in the United States, said, "Well, Mike, it is time to prepare for this unpleasant ordeal," at the same time placing a stool for the condemned man to sit upon, and motioned for the barber to proceed. Then, and not until then, did the condemned man abandon all hope. From that time until 12 o'clock, he moved about as one in a trance, utterly oblivious to all his surroundings, while this scene was being enacted in the silent hall of death. Superintendent Martin, supervisor of the prison's generator, and his attendant were making a final test of the chair. All things seemed in perfect order, and the superintendent expressed himself as being perfectly satisfied that so far as his part was concerned, the execution would be a success. There's a lot of CYA going on in that last sentence because of what happened. Just as the old clock struck the fatal stroke of 12, the muffled tread of approaching footsteps were heard within the outer corridor. In another moment, the old death chamber door swung open, revealing a crowd of 35 or 40 men formed in a semicircle around the fatal chair. At a nod from Deputy Warden Wood, the death march was taken up, and Schiller appeared in the doorway, leaning heavily on the arm of Guard O'Brien. Skilled hands quickly adjusted the straps. The death-dealing electrodes were placed upon the shaven head and calf of the leg. The black cap, which completes the last act of the fatal drama, was drawn over the eyes. The hush of death was on the assembly. The dropping of a pin, at that moment, would have grated harshly on the nerves of the spectators. Warden Edward Hershey asked in a clear, firm voice, "Michael Schiller, have you anything to say before the sentence of the court shall finally have been carried out?" Schiller's lips moved, but no sound came from them. The warden held his watch in his right hand. With his left, he reached for the fatal lever, and as he broke it, the body of Schiller shot upward as far as the clamps would allow it to go. There was a low, hissing sound as the 1,750 volts of electricity went coursing through his body. This was continued for 7 seconds. Then the current was reduced to 250 volts for the remainder of the minute. Then the current was shut off, and the body relaxed. Dr. Thomas, chief physician for the prison, examined the heart, pulse, and eyes. 5 other physicians did the same thing, and all pronounced him dead. The warden and the spectators filed out of the room and up the long hallway. The attending guards loosened the clamps and were in the act of laying him on the cooling board, but, oh, horrors. A stifled sigh comes from the lips, A gurgling sound emanates from the throat. He gasps and struggles for breath. Fogel's story continues after editor's note. Editor's note. Exclamation points aside. It was the most shocking thing the prison officials had ever seen, pun intended. When he was declared dead by 5 physicians, the crowd of 35 spectators, including the warden, filed out of the death chamber. After they had left, Schiller's body was unstrapped from the chair. He lurched forward and fell over. He was still alive. He was straightened up in the chair, and he began to breathe heavily. Saliva was falling from his mouth, and guttural groans sounded throughout the chamber, chilling the strongest men to the very heart. The Cincinnati Enquirer reported later that day. Surviving did not mean it was over for Schiller. All death warrants state the prisoner shall be executed until he or she is dead. They were going to have to do it again. But it would take 2 minutes to reassemble everyone and have the generator in the power plant turned back on. During that time, the Enquirer continued, Schiller seemed to be regaining consciousness. At one time, he appeared to throw back his head as if making a desperate effort to talk. The sight was absolutely sickening. Spectators expected to see him recover. Fogel's story continues. A courier was dispatched for the warden. The crowd was reassembled. The straps were quickly readjusted. By this time, the poor wretch was breathing quite naturally. Then, it was discovered that the current had been shut off at the prison powerhouse, the building that housed the prison's generator to supply electricity. A messenger was dispatched right away to the plant, a distance of several hundred yards. Soon, all was once more in readiness. Again, the levers shot upward. Again, the 1,750 volts of electricity went scorching and singeing through the body of Michael Schiller. This time, the high voltage was continued for 15 seconds, and then reduced to 250 for the remainder of the minute. This time, the doctors made a thorough and careful inspection, and after examining the body for 12 minutes, all declared that he was dead beyond the shadow of a doubt. Or was he? Once more, the crowd dispersed. The body was lifted from the chair and placed upon the floor to await the coming of the undertaker. The warden had reached his office, and a majority of the crowd had started home. Schiller's body was unstrapped from the chair and carefully pulled to the floor where he was placed in the traditional position for burial. 2 of the guards then covered his corpse with a sheet, and he was left there to await removal by the prison cemetery crew. As the guards were about to leave the execution room, Schiller let out a long, painful groan. The guards were horror-stricken and looked in terror at one another. Again, the gurgling sound was heard to come from the throat of Michael Schiller. Chief Guard O'Brien raised the sheet, and a sickening sight met his gaze. The man was gasping and struggling for breath. Again, the warden was summoned. This time, he and the attending physicians came alone. There would be no spectators for the 3rd and final execution of Michael Schiller. Let us draw the curtain upon this sickening scene. Suffice it to say that the voltage was increased to such an extent that no human being could come in contact with it and live. The increased voltage literally burned the top of the head to a crisp. Great was the condemnation of the press the next morning. But who was to blame? Expert electricians were summoned from all over the country. All pronounced the entire apparatus in first-class order and exonerated Superintendent of Electricity, Marden, from any and all censure. Schiller had scarcely tasted water for several days prior to his execution. This is the only plausible theory for his great resistance. The black population of the prison all declared that it was because he was the 13th man to die in the chair. Schiller murdered his wife in Youngstown, Mahoning County, Ohio, June 1st, 1903, literally disemboweling her with a butcher knife. Drunkenness on his part and refusal by his wife to give him more money led to the tragedy. Schiller was foreign-born, ignorant, and illiterate, but by economy and thrift had amassed quite a snug little fortune. But whiskey proved his ruin. Even his little children shrank in terror from him while he was confined in the annex and begged their nurse to take them away from him. His crime was a dastardly one, and the price he paid for it is beyond human description. Editor's note. His children were deathly afraid of him. After his arrest, his daughter Minnie, 12, and 2 sons, Gustav, 8, and Fred, 4, were allowed to visit their father on 2 occasions in the weeks before his execution. After their mother's murder and father's arrest, the children were separated by sex and placed in 2 different orphanages. Although they could have been adopted prior to his execution, Schiller refused to relinquish his parental rights, as he was hoping to use his daughter to plead for his life to the governor. During their second and final meeting together, shortly before his execution, Schiller begged her to call upon the governor in the hope he would find it impossible to turn down a young, sobbing girl. The following account is from a Cincinnati Enquirer article published 12 to 14 hours after Schiller was executed. "Go to the governor and save my life, Minnie," Schiller pleaded. "I cannot go," she answered. "Then write to him, for God's sake, and tell him not to let me be electrocuted." "No, I don't want to do that," Minnie answered in an emotional voice. "The governor has decided, and I do not want to ask him anyhow." According to the Cincinnati Enquirer, this angered the father, and he scolded the child. A nun, who had accompanied the child to Columbus from her orphanage in Cincinnati, told a reporter that Minnie feared her father would kill her as he did her mother. She did not want to make the trip, and made the nuns promise her she would not be left alone with her father. There was a demonstration of Minnie's fear during the final visit, when Sister House Gardner expressed a desire to see the electric chair. The Enquirer continued. She told the child she would be back in a minute and started, but Minnie followed, declaring she would not stay with her father, even with the prison guard present. The day before his execution, Schiller, who was Austro-Hungarian, met with the same attorney who handled his ex-wife's estate. He authorized the attorney to liquidate his property holdings in both the United States and Austria-Hungary. Then, only after some of that money was used to erect a burial monument, did he want the money to go to his 3 children. Newspapers barely mentioned the name of the victim. Her name was Mary, she was 38 years old, and she was Hungarian. The Akron Beacon Journal was one of the few to remember her following her ex-husband's botched execution. The deceased's crime, Schiller's crime, a peculiarly brutal one, was wife murder. Late in the afternoon of June 1st, 1903, Michael Schiller, a saloon keeper of Youngstown, whose wife had secured a divorce from him and the custody of their 4 children, called at her residence and demanded that she resume her marital relations with him, informing her that if she refused to comply, he would cut her heart out. Schiller had been drinking and was in an ugly mood. Mrs. Schiller refused to yield to the request and, escaping from his grasp, ran into the backyard to call for assistance. Schiller caught and held her while he stabbed her in the abdomen with a butcher knife. She was removed to the hospital, where she made an ante-mortem statement detailing the facts of the murderous assault. She died 5 days later. The attack of Schiller on his wife was witnessed by neighbors, who seized him and held him until the police arrived. After the tragedy, Schiller never made any inquiry regarding the condition of his wife, and when informed of her death, exhibited no emotion. Shortly before the homicide, Mrs. Schiller sent $4,000 to her former home in Hungary, the 2021 equivalent of $112,000 when adjusted for inflation, and was preparing to take her children there and educate them when she was murdered. Always in an ugly mood, before Mrs. Schiller obtained her decree of divorce, Schiller had been sent to the workhouse, having beaten her until she was scarcely able to appear against him. At the penitentiary, where he arrived July 30th, 1903, he displayed a stolid indifference. He maintained a stubborn silence, and has been ever in a morose and ugly state of mind. When visited by his children for the last time, he exhibited little sentiment. Michael Willow of Youngstown, administrator of Mrs. Schiller's estate, spent part of the evening with Schiller and received from him power to administer an estate of unknown value, which Schiller said he owned in Austria-Hungary. The murderer asked that the proceeds from the sale of the property be given to his 3 children in Cleveland after a monument to him had been erected. Moses Johnson, colored, will be electrocuted tonight for the murder of an insurance agent in Portsmouth. Father Kelly, a Catholic priest, labored for hours with Schiller, but was unable to obtain from him a confession of religious faith. His little daughter had written him, urging him to accept Christianity.